Hey guys, this is Anthony Morganti from AnthonyMorganti.com. This is episode 30 of the video series where I critique and process your image. In this episode, we're taking a look at this image from Kevin. I think it's a really nice composition. I think Kevin did a really nice job. And I think it's going to be a relatively easy image to process. So we're just going to use Lightroom for this shot. Now, as far as the composition itself, I like it a lot. Kevin didn't bullseye the boat. It's off to the side. It's a nicely balanced image. But there's a couple little things. I mean, very little. We have a reflection of that mast, and it's cut off. So usually when you have a reflection, even if you have rippling water and you have some reflection there, you'd like to capitalize on that. And what I mean by that is I always say when you approach a scene, look at what's the best part of the scene, what's the most interesting part of the scene. You want to make sure you exploit that. And how do you exploit that? Well, you use various compositional rules that might exploit it and compositional clues that might exploit it, like leading lines and framing and things like that. Now in this case we have this great reflection. It's off to the side. I like how he framed the image, but it is cut off. Well, how do you incorporate it? He could zoom out, he could move back, he could get lower and shoot a little bit up so you get a little more of the foreground in the shot when you get lower. And you would have hopefully been able to get the entire reflection in the shot and still keep the mast itself in the shot not cut off. And when you do that, also the horizon wouldn't be right in the middle anymore. So you'd vary that horizon line so you'd have it in a different spot, and that helps make the shot a little more interesting. Or sometimes, if possible, not sure what the layout of the land was, if you could get higher and shoot down on it, you would move that horizon up and you would still get the entire mast in the shot, and hopefully you'd get the reflection in the shot. So all different things you could do of where you position yourself or the focal length of the lens you use to try to get that reflection in the shot. The other thing you could do, and a lot of people don't know you could do this with Lightroom. They do know that you can make panoramas in Lightroom, but everyone just assumes that the panorama's, a horizontal panorama. You can make vertical panoramas too. So what you would do is you would point your camera down, shoot so that you're getting that entire reflection in that first shot. Then tilt your camera up and overlap the shot by 1/3 to 1/4 and take a second shot. And then Lightroom will stitch those together perfectly so that you have a nice vertical panorama. Now, of course, you're going to lose your 2:3 ratio. You're going to have more of a square image, but that's okay. It's a nice balanced image. You have that reflection in there, and then you could process it to take advantage of that reflection to exploit it. That's why I always say you want to exploit the best part of the image. You want to minimize the bad part of the image. There's nothing really bad in this image, but as I look at the image, because the reflection's cut off, it's not really usable, or it's not. I don't want to exploit it. I don't want to exploit the reflection that's cut off. So because of that, now we do have a lot in the foreground here that really doesn't have anything super interesting in it. And when someone's looking at our image, we want them to really key in on the best part of the image, and that's the boat and the sky. So when I actually start processing, I'm probably going to crop it a little just to take some of this big space in the foreground and midground out a little bit. So we'll talk about that when we get to it. Now, as far as the composition or the camera settings, I think they were perfect. It was a Fujifilm X-T2 camera with a 16-55 f/2.8 lens, and I always mention that you'd like to shoot landscapes in your camera's sweet spot, which is 2 to 4 stops up from wide open. And when I say up, it's a higher number up. So f/2.8 is wide open, and f/8 is perfect. So very nicely done. We're at 1/800th of a second, ISO 200. I think it's perfect. I think his camera settings were perfect. It came out really nice. So nothing really to talk about there. Now about focusing, that focus point plugin for Lightroom does not work with Fuji cameras or Fuji RAW files. But if it were me, I'd focus on the boat, because that's the subject of the image. So that's what I would focus on. Shoot f/8. You'd get more than enough depth of field to get everything in focus, and you're done. So looks really nice. Now we're going to about processing it. Now I mentioned that I think that the foreground, there's just a little bit too much here that really isn't adding anything to the shot. There is ripple in the water, so we're not really getting a clean, clear reflection of the clouds That would help if it was like perfectly still. But we have that ripple, so it's kind of taking that reflection away. So I'm going to crop it. So I'm going to open up the crop tool, and I have the rule of thirds overlay here. And I think I'll just bring it up from this left-hand corner. So I'm getting rid of a little bit of that foreground, and I'm going to move it so that this left-hand vertical rule of thirds line is right on top of the boat's mast. So I think that's good. So it's right there. The point of intersection is right here, sorry, down here. So, you know, it's close. It's right on the boat. Good. We still have that reflection cut off. Nothing we could do about that, so we're just going to ignore that. We're just going to, you know, look at it, and I think that's good. I think that looks nice right there. So there's our crop, simple. And I think it just tightened it up just enough. It moved that boat a little bit more towards the left-hand rule of thirds line, and I think it's really a nicely balanced image because of just the way Kevin framed it to begin with. You have the boat more toward the left, and we have this hill on the right, more from the middle to the right. So it's nicely balanced, and it's perfectly straight shot. We don't have to worry about straightening it. By the way, I mentioned that this was a Fujifilm X-T2. That is a mirrorless camera, so the lens corrections were already applied to the raw file. I don't have to worry about clicking this box. It already came with the remove chromatic aberration box checked. So we're just going to process it. Now, this comes down to personal taste, but to me, I think the scene is a little bit too cool. A little bit too cool. I'd like to warm it up a little bit. And what I'll usually do is I'll go to the drop down first, and I'll try some of these different presets that are in the drop down that came along with the raw file. And I'll just go to auto, see what that looks like. And that warmed it up a little bit too much for my taste. Daylight. Daylight's a little closer to what I like. Cloudy's a little too warm also. Just barely though. Shade's going to be warmer than that, so I don't care for that. Now, tungsten and fluorescent are going to go the wrong way. That's going to cool it way off. So we're not even going to try fluorescent. Flash sometimes will surprise you on a non-flash shot. It's okay. But I think what we'll do is we'll go to as shot, and I'm going to get a custom white balance by using the eyedropper. And I did cover this in a previous video. You just click on the tool there, and we have the eyedropper. And you're going to pick a target neutral, it says in that box. Well, what does that mean? Well, you're going to look for something in the scene that is 18% gray. And if you have eyes that could spot 18% gray in a scene, then good for you. But not every scene has 18% gray card laying in it somewhere. So you have to find something that is in that tonal range that's near 18% gray. And the way I found that works really well with this eyedropper tool, if you look at the box, it says pick a target neutral, and at the bottom it has values for R, G, and B. What you want is those, they're in percentage. You want those numbers as close to each other as possible. You can see right now it's 43.5 for R, green is 46, and blue is 54.4. Kind of a little bit too spread out. You like them as close as possible. Now, it doesn't matter what the numbers say, really. I mean, they could all be 70s, in the 70s. You know, 72, 74, 76.2. As long as they're relatively close together, that's what you're going for. So you just look for something in the image that you think might be middle gray and try to go over it. And then you could see here we are 50.8, 52.8, 56.7. And I would just try to move around in here until I get them as close as possible. Now, again, you're rarely ever going to find these real super close, like within tenths of percentages from each other. But you just try to do your best. Now, for the sake of this video, I'm not going to go hunting around forever. But right now, we have them all in the 50s. 51.3, 53.4, and 57.3. So I'm just going to click right there with the left mouse button. It warmed it up very slightly. I like that, though. I think that looks nice. So I'm going to put the tool away by clicking right there. So we're done with that. So now we're just going to process it like we normally do. And I mentioned it's going to be simple processing, I think. And I'm just going to use Lightroom for it. And I have my little quirks of the way I like to process an image. So I start out with highlights. And typically what I'll do with the highlight slider, I'll just move it one way or the other until I see that the brightest part of the image has some detail in it. That's the way I like to do it. And the brightest part of the image is like right in here. So I'll just go to that slider and I'll just move it to the left until it has some detail. Sometimes I'll zoom in even, you know, and I kind of will, you know, jog it back and forth just to get my eyes settled on an area to look at. And I could see I'm getting some detail in here now. So I kind of like it right there at -77. So that's good. Similarly with shadows, I'll do that, but I look at a dark spot. And I usually will open that up quite a bit. Now it's flattening the image, and generally that doesn't look as nice when it's flat. But we're going to add contrast later. Now, you could add contrast with the contrast slider if that's the way you prefer. I prefer to use the tone curve. I think it looks better for the way I like processing my images. And I do have a video that compares the contrast slider and the tone curve to add contrast. They actually affect the histogram differently. And to me, I just like the way the tone curve does it. So I will link to that video below in the description below this video if you'd like to watch that video. It might give you an idea why I prefer to use the tone curve and what it's actually doing to the pixels of the image differently than the contrast slider. Conversely, for your style, you might like the contrast slider, and if you do, I encourage you to do it your way. So I did that. I usually will go down. I don't do clarity yet. I'll go to vibrance, and I usually add just a little vibrance. It's usually between 5 and 10. I don't go too crazy on vibrance. Like I think around 8 is good right here. I almost never add saturation, so I'm not going to. And then I'll just use the drop down on the tone curve, and I look at medium contrast. Then I'll look at strong contrast. For this image, I like strong contrast. Then I go back up to the basic panel, and I adjust the whites and blacks. And I have people ask me, why do I do tone curve before I do whites and blacks? Well, for some images, the white and black point would be different after or before the tone curve, between which one you do it, where you do it. And I prefer to get a very accurate white and black point, at least accurate for my image, the way I like to process my image. I like to do it after I do contrast, and I do contrast through the tone curve. So I do that first, then I do my white and black point. In this image, to tell you the truth, it probably doesn't really matter as much because there's not a lot of tonal variation in this image. There's not a lot of parts of this image that are super bright and other parts that are super dark with lots of shade of gray in between. So it's not going to matter as much. But I still do it. It's kind of my routine of the way I do it. So I do shadows, highlights, vibrance, tone curve, then I come back and I do whites and blacks. And the way I usually will do is I'll try automatic settings first. So I'll hold the shift key in and double click on the word whites, and that will give me an auto white point. You can see it brightened up considerably. I'll hold the shift key in again and double click on the word blacks to get an automatic black point, and that darkened up slightly. Now, it's too bright for my personal taste. So I'm going to hold the J or press the J key in just to see clipping points. You also could click on these individual triangles up here in the histogram or just hover over them. And if you hover on that right one, you could see that I'm getting some clipping over here on the left. So if I hold the J key in or push the J key in, we see we're just clipping slightly right in here. And we're not clipping shadows at all. If we were clipping shadows, we'd get blue. So I'm going to click on that J key again to turn those off. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a more personal white and black point by holding the Alt or Option key in. Alt if you have a PC, Option if you have a Mac. And I'm going to click on whites first. And when I click down, you'll see the entire screen turned black, except we have some little bit blotches over there on the left. I moved slightly, but we have some green over there, a little bit of red coming through. So I'm clipping greens and I'm clipping reds a little bit. So I'm going to back that off. And I'm going to back it off till they're totally gone. So that's a better white point for my personal taste. Now I'm going to hold the same thing, the Alt or Option key, and again I'm going to click on the blacks slider. You can see I'm clipping blues and greens over there a little bit. And I like to clip, my personal preference, my personal style is I like to clip blacks a little bit more than whites. Whereas I don't like to clip whites at all. I like to clip blacks slightly. To me, that adds a little tonal depth to the image. So I clip blacks a little more, and you can see I think that looks better than those auto points looked. At least for my personal taste, I think it looks better. Now clarity will add a little bit of micro contrast, mid-tone contrast they call it, to the image. So I'm going to click on the clarity slider now, and I'm just going to move that to the right until I like the clarity. Usually I don't add a ton of clarity. I think around 30 for this image works great. So I like that. So I'm done with the basic panel. Now, I already did the contrast using the tone curve, so I'm not going to do anything else with the tone curve. I like the colors in this image, so I'm not going to enhance any of the colors with the HSL Color B&W tab. What I'll typically do is a lot of times if this hill was uniformly green with the same tone all the way through, then I might want to mess with that a little bit and try to get some tonal variance in those greens. I'd like brighter greens, almost yellows, to darker greens. Well, look at the hill naturally. It's got some really bright areas, mid areas, and dark areas. So we have a lot of tonal variance on the hill. We have a lot of tonal variance in the sky. We have a lot of tonal variance everywhere else. So I think it's perfect. So I'm not going to do anything with the HSL Color B&W tab. I'm not going to do any split toning to this. We're going to jump right down to detail. Now, I'm going to zoom in. I like zooming in when I do this. And there's quite a bit of noise. So I'm going to get rid of noise first. And I usually like to move the noise reduction luminance slider in groups of 10. So 10, 20, 30, 40 to begin with. And I'm just going to move it, let's say, to 60. I just pick a number. And look, and there's just a slight amount of noise. And then we're going to move it up to 70. Now I'll go to another like group of 10 further the way I need to go. And 70 eliminated the noise. Then I'll try to zero it in, and I'll go to 65. And 65, the noise is still gone mostly. So I like that. So I'm just going to leave it at 65. Now I want to sharpen the image. I'm going to get to a point or move the image around to an area that I want sharp. And of course, that's our subject, which is the boat. So I'm just going to move sharpening up to an even number, same thing. I'll do like 50. And it's sharp. Now I don't want to get it so sharp. If you have too much sharpness, too much clarity, and too much contrast, when you have, let's say, a dark tree like this, and it's in front of a brighter area like this brighter sky, just slightly brighter in this case, or maybe up here is a better choice. We have this dark tree and the bright cloud behind it. You might get smudging. It'll smudge dark, and you want to avoid that. Conversely, if you have something bright, like we have a real bright spire, and it's going up in front of a really dark cloud, it would like glow almost. And you want to avoid that. So you don't want to do too much sharpening, too much contrast, or too much clarity. Back those down if that starts happening, because you don't want that usually to happen. So we're going to move this up to, let's say, 60. And it brought in a little noise in the sky, but I like the sharpness it did to the boat. So what we're going to do is we're going to mask out the sharpening from the sky. And to do that, we go to the masking slider. We're going to hold that Alt or Option key. And again, that's Alt if you have a PC, Option if you have a Mac. Left click on that, and you can see it's totally white. That means the entire image, every pixel is being sharpened. When I move that to the right, we're going to start introducing some black parts to that image. The black parts are not being sharpened. So I'm just going to move it so the detailed parts of the boat, and there's not a lot of detail in this image to begin with, but that's the part I want sharpened. I want that hillside sharpened. You can see there's a lot of white there, but most of the sky now is black, so we're not sharpening a lot of these clouds. We don't need to sharpen clouds. So we still have a tiny bit of noise, but it's not too bad. If it really bothered us, we could come in here with the noise reduction slider and then tweak that up to, let's say, spec where we were at 70, and it pretty much got rid of that. So I think that looks good. Again, this was a mirrorless camera. We didn't have to do any lens corrections. It's no transform applications needed to this image because it doesn't have really buildings in it or anything. So effects. I like adding vignettes. Now I mentioned, why do you add a vignette? Well, it helps push people's attention more towards the middle of the image. My personal taste is I don't like vignettes like that are super dark. I don't use any white vignettes ever. So I prefer a dark vignette, but not a heavy-handed one, so it will be very light. Now this image is a little tricky to get a vignette on because the sun appears to be more towards the left, and it's brighter on the left side of this screen than it is on the right side of the screen. So although I like the vignette over here, it's too dark over here. So I'd rather have it super light all around than be overbearing on one side. Does that make sense? So minus 10 might even be too much. Minus 8's a little better. So I like that. So I think we're done. I think that's a really nice composed scene with our cropping that we did. And it was a really nice scene to begin with. So not a ton of processing was needed. We just did pretty much normal Lightroom processing. We're going to look at it before and after. There's the Y key. and there's before and after. And if we do the backslash key, there's before, there's after, there's before, there's after. Now it's not showing our crop, but you can see our crop is there too. The before and afters just aren't showing the crop. Okay, so there you go. There's totally processed image. I think it's a really nice scene. It reminds me of something that a watercolor artist might do. I think it's very nice, Kevin. Very well done. Thank you for sharing it with us. And thank you, everyone that watches my videos. I truly do appreciate it. I'll talk to you guys soon.